All right, here we are, our final video session, support for the final call for online learning, adopting the economic perspective today on hard times and taking advantage of current events and current news to explore the issue of the Great Recession and the Great Depression. We want to start by going to the news. And if you were to just Google GDP news, you'd see the stories are all about the 4.8% decrease in the first quarter, that is, the 4.8% decrease in the GDP. And we look, for example, at this New York Times piece. It gives us a nice graphic and an excellent headline. Worst economy in a decade. What's next? The worst in our lifetime? Now, what's of particular interest to us as economists is this graph, which is showing the first quarter of 2020 that we've just come out of with this minus 4.8 GDP growth. And notice how they're contrasting that or comparing it to the Great Recession of 2007 and 2009. It's going to be a comparison you hear a lot about, and I think pretty quickly you'll be asking about potential comparisons to the Great Depression, and that's going to be our focus today. As a sort of preamble, I want to start with the economics perspective on this 5% drop in the GDP, and just emphasize the point that although that's a big economic cost of social distancing and sheltering in place, and these other measures were taken to slow the spread of COVID, I want to emphasize that as from an economics point of view, it sure seems to be a good call. For example, these U of Chicago economists suggesting conservatively that 1.7 million lives in the U.S. will be saved by October by social distancing and measures that do slow down the economy. But assigning a monetary value to those lives saved, they say that's worth about $8 trillion or 37% of U.S. GDP as of 2019. So the point here is that even the very pessimistic suggestions that we might lose 10% of our GDP would still put us at a number and a value that is far short of what from an economics point of view is the value of the lives that are being saved. And even that we would suspect as economists is kind of a very cautious understatement of how glad we are not to be facing a death toll in the millions or so. But our focus for economics is to think in terms of what lies ahead and the comparisons people are making to the, quote, Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. And also to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And our focus here is to have a quick look at those two quote-unquote great events using some figures from Michael Bordeaux's paper and also some tables from the St. Louis Fed. So we want to start with the punchline. The punchline being simply that the Great Recession is called great because it threatened to become another Great Depression and not because it was a particularly terrible recession. The two tables I want you to look at and read the accompanying text, but let's just have a quick look and highlight here, and we'll zoom in just a little bit further. Notice the path of the GDP in the Great Recession, starting from a value of 100. It slid down to something like 95 or 96 and then recovered. And if we had continued the data, this little blue line would continue up by here and GDP growth would have carried on like my arrows going here. In contrast, the Great Depression is this extraordinary collapse of GDP, so much greater the decline in GDP and over such a huge period of time, in contrast to this, what in this context would appear to be a bit of a blip. Now that's all very positive, but It'd be dishonest not to point out that the first quarter of 2020, I've graphed it here, this little line here. If you look closely, you'll notice that at least for the first quarter, the U.S. economy is on a path that looks an awful lot like the Great Depression. But the good news is we're pretty sure we know how to avoid that from continuing down into such a catastrophe, although that's beyond the scope of our discussion today. The other thing you'll be tested briefly on if you take the optional testing associated with this next Tuesday is what happened to unemployment in the Great Recession compared to the Great Depression. Here the contrast is not perhaps as great. If we start with the lower of the two lines, this is what happened to unemployment during the Great Recession. Kind of flat for a while at 5% before it came up and spiked around 10% and held there, and then began and carried on with a very long and gentle decline, so that after about 10 years, by 2017 or so, it was back down below 5%, and indeed until the onset of the COVID recession, it had dropped to historic lows. The point we want to emphasize, though, is the Great Depression was a whole other sort of experience, with unemployment spiking up much more in a similar time period to 25%, gradually declining for a while, but then jumping up again. And by the time we come to a 10-year period, by 1939, the unemployment rate was still something like 15%. So in both cases, unemployment a more persistent problem than when we look at the GDP side of it. But again, a notion simply that in terms of duration and severity, the unemployment and the GDP pictures both tell us that the Great Recession was not great because it was so much worse than other recessions. Instead, it was great because it threatened to become another depression. To wrap it up, I want to show you a quick picture of the graphing of real GDP. I encourage you to consider going to this St. Louis Federal Reserve site, and you can plot your own data. Here we've got the country's GDP, and we've got the bad news in here that it's gone down from, in the fourth quarter, 19.2 trillion to 18.9 trillion. And of course, we're just hoping that that blip doesn't turn into something catastrophic. But for immediate purposes, I just want you to notice the width of these gray lines. Scan over it, and you'll notice that the Great Recession, this most recent one we saw here, 2007 through 2009, might be wider than the other ones, but it's a very similar magnitude. And if we look to get a sense of how severe the recession was, we're going to edit this graph very quickly. Instead of billions of $20 of 2012, we're going to go to the continuously compounded annual rate of change, like for our growth rates we talk about. And when we look at that, we can see, oh yeah, there's the Great Recession, bottoming out at minus 9% decrease in quarter 4 of 2008. We can go back to the late 1950s and find one recession that is deeper. But really, we want to emphasize that this drop here for the Great Recession is not really great compared to the other drops in GDP. And instead, we have to return to the picture of GDP in comparison. There's the Great Recession's drop in GDP. There's the Great Depression. Depression, recession, world of difference. All right, a little more discussion in the handout about the important idea that the lessons learned from the Great Depression were lessons that were put into play in terms of informing the policies that were taken in 2007 and later, especially monetary policy, to avoid and prevent a collapse of the international monetary and financial systems. If you're interested in those issues, I encourage you to carry on learning, maybe take another course in economics, or maybe you can just do some Googling and learn about the whys and hows of avoiding another Great Depression. Aggressive monetary and fiscal policy in 2007 and 2008 prevented another Great Depression. And so far, it's looking like similar sorts of aggressive policies from governments are going to prevent another catastrophic economic outcome, prevent another Great Depression. And if we do our bit and stay home and do our social distancing, then we'll also, we hope and trust, avoid a catastrophic medical outcome. With that, I wish good health to all. And as Porky Pig used to say, that's all, folks.